So what would it mean for Christianity if we woke up tomorrow and the headlines read, there is alien life? The government, the scientists, everyone admits that there is alien life. What would it mean for Christianity? There are lots of questions. I've done videos on this, or a video on this, about what that would mean in general for Christianity. In this talk, I want to look at specifically what would it mean for Christology, or would Jesus have had to die for these aliens if these aliens did in fact exist? Now, we're going to look at several different views on this. The first question people ask you, well, what does the Bible say? And some people will say, well, there just are no aliens because the Bible doesn't tell us that there are any. And the question I guess I would ask then is, well, if there were aliens, would God have to tell us that? Would the Bible have to tell us those things? We know from Deuteronomy 29:29 that there are secret things that belong to the Lord, and God does not have to tell us everything in his plan in general, his plan of salvation or redemption. So the Bible just simply does not say one way or the other if aliens or other life on other planets in the universe exist or don't exist. So we have to figure out if aliens exist or not based on really empirical investigation. Now, there's a whole host of questions about UFOs, other planets. Are there other life forms on other planets? There's been discussions as of late about the government finding so-called spacecraft, or what they're calling UAP, with biologics on board. And so that raises the question for people, well, what would that mean for Christianity? Some people like Paul Davies, who is a physicist, would say that such alien life would pose problems, especially for Christianity, because we teach a view that God became man and took on human nature. And so it is specifically unique to Christianity that God came down and took on the nature of humanity to be able to save them. So there are lots of questions that arise on this topic. What does the Bible say? I don't think it says anything personally. Would it necessarily have to? I don't think it would. And then, is it a problem for Christianity? Well, it certainly raises questions. And so right out of the gate, let me just say that I don't personally think that there are other aliens in the universe. I think there are problems with that. However, just for the sake of argument, let's assume that there are. And what kind of questions would that raise for Christian theology, specifically Christology? That is the view or the idea of and doctrines about Jesus becoming man and saving us. So we have to ask certain questions about that. One question is, well, would they even need to be saved? Now, we're talking about rational beings because only rational beings would need to be saved. We don't typically ask questions about animals and in the world, like zebras or other animals, about whether they needed to be saved. There are different views about whether they go to heaven, but not really about did Jesus have to take on their form. In fact, we see that Jesus did not take on the form of angels, and we as Christians believe that there are fallen angels, and Jesus did not take on their form. So the question is, did he have to save them? It doesn't seem that he has to do anything in that regard. He doesn't have to save humans for that matter. And so I don't think that we can say that God has to save anybody. He chooses to save some, and that's his prerogative as the creator. But would they need to be saved? If God wanted to save them, are they going to have some kind of conscious existence after their death, supposing that they do die and that they're mortal, that they have some kind of conscious life after death for these alleged rational beings? Well, one question that goes along with that is, are they sinful? So this whole discussion is predicated on the idea that these other beings, if they do exist, are sinful. Well, other questions about that and sub-questions to that question would be, well, why are they sinful? How are they sinful? Are they sinful because of human beings, because of the fall in the Garden of Eden, or are they sinful because of their own particular sin? All these would have to be explored and discussed. So, but in order to be able to be saved, it would seem they would have to be rational. They would have to have some kind of sin, or they wouldn't need to be saved. The question, I guess, would be if they didn't have any sin, would they just go to heaven with humans, or in their own kind of heaven, or whatever? Another question that sometimes theologians ask about this is, would they have to have the image of God in order to be saved? So we would argue that it doesn't seem like the angels have this imago Dei, or it's not mentioned in Scripture that the angels have this imago Dei. Lots of questions about what the imago Dei is, and there just is no specific definition explicitly about what it is. Theologians differ on this as to what it is. Many people say, well, it's being rational, it's being moral, it's having free will, it's having a spiritual aspect. The Bible just simply does not say this is what it means to be in God's image. It says that God made us in his image, but it does not say this is what it means to be in his image. We could argue that angels are rational, they're spiritual, and they have apparently a moral component because some are evil and some are good. And they have moral laws imposed on them, or they wouldn't even be evil in that regard. So theologians differ on this. Now, all of this, as I presented at a conference in 2023, October, on the question of the implications of theology, Christian theology, if we didn't see alien life, I discovered that there actually is a whole sub-discipline on this in theology, and it is called Astro Theology or Cosmotheology. And sometimes theologians will parse out differences among those headings or those titles, but really it's just about how does Christian theology apply to other beings in the universe. Okay. So we already asked the question, does God have to save? I'm going to argue, no, he does not have to save. Did Jesus have to die for us? Well, the scriptures do say that without the shedding of blood, there can be no remission of sins. So people will say that God had to send Jesus to save us. But this raises another question, is what does it mean for God to be under some kind of obligation or requirement to do something like this? Is it really the case that Jesus had to die in order to save humans? Well, according to scriptures, it does say that there had to be a shedding of blood for remission of sins. But did God, is it that way because God had to follow some cosmic rule book saying that God had to die? Or did God just will it to be that way? Well, I'm going to argue the latter. And this is a distinction in theology between what's oftentimes called absolute necessity and suppositional necessity. Absolute necessity is something like that cannot be otherwise. Absolutely, there's no possible way it could be otherwise. So God existing is absolutely necessary. So God can't stop existing or willing his own existence or existing the way he does. Suppositional or conditional necessity is where God wills something or something happens. It didn't have to be that way, but supposing that it is that way, in some sense it's necessary. So I'm sitting right now. So there is some sense in which it is necessary that I'm sitting. Now, I don't have to be, I could stand up, but because I'm sitting, or supposing I'm sitting, suppositional necessity, then I am said to be sitting in a sense necessarily, not absolutely, because I could possibly be standing or lying down or whatever. So I'm going to argue that God is under no absolute necessity to save human beings or to save them in any given way, but he did will to do that. He did will not only to save them, but to save them through the incarnation of Jesus. Jesus taking on human nature and living a sinless life, giving his life as a ransom, dying for us, and being raised such that if we believe on him and in his person and work, then we will be saved from our sin because of what he did, because of who he is, and what he did. So then that will raise the question of, would Jesus have had to do that for other aliens if there were such things or not? Well, it's possible, at least, given that if there's no absolute necessity in God saving people or beings, creatures, by becoming one of them and shedding blood. God could have willed a different way to save humans, or even if there were other aliens that way. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that God would have had to die for either humans or other rational sentient beings. Supposing that he did, though, supposing he did have to be incarnated in the species he wants to save, then the question arises, well, that is the question. Does he have to be incarnated in that specific species? Has there got to be a species-specific incarnation? Or can Jesus save all of sentient beings in the universe, if there are other ones, simply by incarnating as Jesus of Nazareth in the first century in Israel and fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies, living his life, dying, and being raised from the dead? There are different views on this, as you can imagine. Some theologians argue that, and this is interesting, that Paul Davies, the physicist I mentioned who is an atheist, who said this is a bad problem for Christianity, he does recognize there are ways out of this problem, like what we're going to cover right now, that Jesus could have saved these other beings in different ways. I don't think that there's any logical contradiction with Christianity in this regard, but it does raise questions. So some theologians do say that Jesus would not have to be incarnated in any other species, but he could have saved other species by virtue of becoming a human, becoming part of creation in general, and saving all sentient beings that needed to be saved. This would be sort of in line with the Catholic view of inclusivism, such that you don't have to believe explicitly on Jesus to be saved. You can be a good Buddhist or Muslim or whatever, but you are saved only because of Jesus and what he did, even if you don't know that or believe that. This would be different from exclusivism, which says that you have to explicitly believe on Jesus, which raises the question about would other sentient beings have knowledge of Jesus unless he came into their own species in their own world and became one of them. So again, some theologians say that there does not need to be but one incarnation. There can just be one incarnation. He can be a human, and through his one death and resurrection, atone for the sins of all humans. Take the inclusivist view, whether they believe on him or not. And some theologians say that also applies to other sentient, sinful beings, if there were any, because of what he did in the first century as the Son of God and as coming into creation in general. Even though his species was human specific, he came in creation, and just by coming into creation, that was enough to bridge the gap between creator and creation. The other view is called the multiple incarnation view, which is the idea that Jesus had to, good guess, have multiple incarnations. He had to, if he's going to save a species, he has to incarnate in that given species. So theologians difference, and I was surprised in learning about these different views that this is not really a new question. This has been around for at least decades, if not centuries, with theologians asking these questions about what would it mean for Jesus to be incarnate or have multiple incarnations. In fact, Thomas Aquinas talks about this. And he says that there's nothing that would prohibit Jesus from being incarnated in multiple ways or times, because the humanity of Jesus is not part of the divine essence. Okay, so since the humanity of Jesus is not necessarily or not part of the divine being, it's a separate nature altogether, then it doesn't add anything to the divine essence. It just merely adds a nature to the person of Jesus, and there could be multiple incarnations. And he doesn't say specifically multiple races or species, but it seems the principle would be the same, that if there can be multiple incarnations because there's not any kind of necessity with the incarnation as a human to the divine essence, then there's nothing that would apparently preclude him from becoming incarnate as another being. This raises yet another question, or a myriad of questions about this topic, that raises about the issue of, well, what happens to the divine, what happens to the human nature? Is there any kind of overlap or transference from the divine nature from the human nature to the divine nature? This is called the communication of attributes, or if you want the big fat fancy Latin phrase, the communicatio idiomata. So the communication of attributes is the idea that what one nature has, be it the divine nature or the human nature, is attributed to the one person. So whatever the divine nature has, that one person has, namely the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ. Or whatever the human nature has is also communicated to the one person. So the one person shares both divine and human attributes. And so the question is what kind of overlap is there? Did Jesus as the human person enjoy such things as omnipotence and other divine attributes? Well, it doesn't seem like this would be a problem in the sense of, the question here is if Jesus takes on different natures of aliens, does whatever occur to those natures as being incarnated as an alien affect in some way the one person, the second person of the Trinity, because of the communication of attributes? So if he is incarnated as 30 different kinds of aliens or whatever, is there something about those 30 different incarnations that have some kind of effect or add something to the divine person of the Trinity, the essence of Jesus, the divine essence of Jesus, through the communication of attributes, or the communicatio idiomata? And theologians who like to keep a strong split between the natures, the divine and human nature, and this has been debated much since the Reformation, and is debated especially between Lutherans and Reformed theologians, but all theologians have to deal with these kind of questions. And I would agree that there's nothing predicated or changing the divine person by taking on the addition of the human nature. That taking on the human nature is just that. It is an addition of the human nature, and because God is immutable and impassible and eternal, is not affected in that regard. So I don't think that the second person of the Trinity is in any way changed because he took on the human nature in his incarnation. And I don't think that adding other incarnations would affect him in that way either. So I don't see the communication of attributes as being a problem here. So would Jesus have had to had a single or a multiple incarnation? Well, we have to ask what is exactly required and who's doing the requiring. Simply put, there is no definitive answer in terms of what Jesus would have done, because first of all, we have no reason to believe this ever happened, so we don't have a model for it, and we also are not in a position to dictate what God would have to do. We can't, in understanding the distinction between absolute and conditional necessity, believe that God is under no absolute necessity to do anything, that he doesn't have to follow any kind of cosmic pattern or rule book in saving his creatures. So could God have saved other species of life through the one incarnation of Jesus? If he wanted to do that, I'm sure he could have done that. The question that some people bring up is that the best way for God to share his love for them? If there were such beings, then we as humans believe that God, we know from John 3:16 that the way God showed his love is by becoming one of us and giving his life for us. So would it be a better way for Jesus to somehow become one of that species and in some way sacrifice himself like he did for us. One thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that we should not give up what we do know because of what we don't know. Let me say that again. We should not give up what we do know because of what we don't know. So we do know that if there were aliens, it does not take away our arguments and reasons for believing that God exists. It also doesn't change anything that happened in the first century for us humans. I'm going to argue that if we woke up tomorrow and saw the headlines that said there are other aliens or sentient beings, we have knowledge of them, the government, scientists, NASA, whoever, coming out and saying that we know these things exist without any kind of shadow of doubt, that, in my opinion, would not disprove Christianity is true, because God would still have to exist. It would not have taken away what Jesus did for us in the first century in Israel. He still would have lived. He still would have lived a sinless life. He would have fulfilled prophecy. He would have foretold and accomplished his own death and resurrection. And our reasons for believing that he did that for us to save us would not be changed in any way, shape, or form. The only difference that scenario would have would be a lot of theological questions about how do those beings fit in to God's plan. But the question of would it change Christianity, I'm going to say no. There's nothing that's obvious from that would give any kind of contradiction to Christianity. Some will say, well, it shows that human beings aren't the center of the universe. That doesn't disprove Christianity. But humans could exist along with other beings. There's nothing that contradicts Scripture. There's nothing that contradicts Christian theology about these other beings existing. So it raises a lot of questions, but I think that we should use the knowledge that we have about God and apologetics and theology to overcome these worries for people who have these worries about aliens or other beings disproving Christianity. The only way to disprove Christianity is to show somehow that our Christian theology is wrong. And that would especially have to be the case with God's existence and the person and work of Jesus Christ. And I'm going to argue that that has not happened, and the alleged existence of aliens would not be proof against it either. So would Jesus have had to die for other aliens? I think that is up to how God would want to communicate his love for them and communicate how he wanted to save them, how he wanted to set up that plan of salvation for them. I don't think there's any necessity in an absolute sense. I think the only necessity would be in the suppositional or conditional sense for how God wanted to save those other species if they did exist, like he did with us. He did not have to be incarnated to save humans, but because he did will that, and because he willed that, then it is necessary, suppositionally, that there has to be the spilling of blood for the remission of sins. I hope that this has made you think and that was interesting for you. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Please subscribe if you like this kind of material and you haven't already. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or want to point out anything interesting about the discussion, please do, and we'll see you next time.